Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Maximize Monday. It's been quite some time. June, July just kind of got out of hand for me. So apologies, but that's what happens in the summer months. It's not like the life of an educator, as you know, Shawna, now anymore. Those summers, you don't have all the time that you might have once had to try to put in some side projects. Not to say that teachers aren't busy in the summer. I know my wife very much is, but not as much free time, I'll say that, as we used to have. So, welcome back. Thank you for joining. This was supposed to be a panel on the candidate experience from recruiter perspectives. A little light today, just some things happened. Again, summer takes over, but I have Shawna with me. She's no stranger to Maximize Monday, so very familiar face here. Shawna, thank you so much for taking some time to jump on here with me and then offer your perspective as well for candidate experience and what you do or try to do to increase the candidate experience overall as they work with you.
hmm My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So just kind of starting off there and in general, going over those goals that you set as a recruiter. You and I work in different spaces, similar but different, internal recruitment, agency recruitment. But at the end of the day, I think overall the goal for everyone in recruitment, if not, it should be is that overall candidate experience because they have the opportunity to work with different companies, with different recruiters. So what makes you kind of stand out, and the easiest way to do that is through your branding and how you kind of engage and interact with the candidates through also when you're going through that process for yourself, what are some of those steps that you try to take, initially when you're having that entry conversation with candidates, in terms of getting their expectations and how you can kind of work through from that. So what are some of those like bullet points or the checklist items that you have of this is what you can expect from me as a recruiter as you and I start this partnership?
Yeah, absolutely. In that first initial call, I'm definitely trying to understand their career goals. Um, because, like you mentioned, I'm an agency recruiter, so I work with multiple companies. I'm reaching out to them usually about one specific position, but I want to know what their career goals are, what they're looking for, because maybe it's not going to be the right fit, this exact position. But we're establishing a relationship and maybe something else will come up that's a better fit. So, I'm very open about that aspect of, here's what I reached out to you about. But I really want to get to know you and what your, interests and career goals are. I try to set a timeline expectation. I will get back to you by this time, whether or not I have an update, in this many days, communication expectations, all of those things, because I know it's nerve-wracking when you're a job seeker and you want information and you want to know how long is it going to take and when am I going to hear something. So, setting those kind of expectations from the beginning are important, and I try to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, you wouldn't know it, but you're fairly new to the recruiting industry now. You moved from education to that, and I think you've kind of hit the ground running. You and I have talked about that in terms of what you've accomplished in this time as a recruiter, but also having that unique perspective where you were the job seeker not too long ago. How do you kind of utilize that mindset that you had from the candidate perspective? Because the communication thing, which you mentioned is a two-way street. And, a lot of candidates kind of get tied up in that, well, I haven't heard from my recruiter yet. So do I keep waiting? What do I do? And I always encourage, it's better to over than under communicate from both sides. And that's especially true. And as I'm sure you've seen for recruiters, there's a lot of moving parts to our daily operations. So we have the best intentions, but those checkpoints and touch points don't always get met like we would like them to. So for you, from the candidate perspective, what was kind of your mindset in terms of this is going to be my level of communication interaction with my recruiter who's helping me or the hiring manager, and how do you use that now that you're on the other side of the desk?
Well, when I was in my own job search, which you're right, it wasn't that long ago, 2 years ago, I didn't even get the chance to work with a recruiter. So it's interesting because I don't have the experience of working with a ton of recruiters. I kind of went in really with a blank slate. And, for good and for bad, there's a lot of people that have a negative connotation towards recruiters. And I've seen that on LinkedIn. I've seen the posts. So I guess in that way, I went in like, I'm not going to be that recruiter. I'm going to go in and kind of break those stereotypes. But I also tell people, uh, like my personality is I'm a huge follow-up person. I'm always following up with people in any way in my life, just even in my personal life. So I always tell my candidates it's okay to follow up with me. It's okay to reach out to me. It doesn't bother me. I always say that line. It doesn't bother me because I think that's people's biggest hesitations is, oh, I don't want to come across as bothering this person. I don't want to nag them. So I use that line like, it doesn't bother me for you to follow up, just so people feel more comfortable because I know that's what I would want if I was in their shoes because I am a big over communicator and I would want someone to tell me that's okay. It's okay to do that.
Yeah. And from the agency perspective, and I deal with this too sometimes working with hiring managers, that the schedules of those that you're working with is also pretty chaotic. So, from a recruiter to a hiring manager or to a company perspective, same thing in terms of that level of communication. So that does come into play as well. So how do you try to manage those expectations then on that side and say this is what we're hoping for and try to get that up front and transparent with the companies, the hiring managers, so you can kind of stick to what your own principles are going to be.
Yeah, I mean it is hard because we are the go-between as the agency recruiter, and we don't control the schedules of the hiring managers. We really try and before we kick off a search to have a plan in place, even blocking our clients' schedules, saying, okay, if you want us to start interviewing people and start sending candidates, then we need this time in 3 days from now, 4 days from now. So we try to proactively, make those arrangements. But it's not always easy. And when I do find that my clients are taking a really long time to schedule interviews, I'm very transparent with them that they could lose out on high level talent if they don't move. And, that's kind of all we can do is just encourage them and say, this person is interviewing at other places, which is usually the case.
Right.
And we need to move this along. But especially in the summer, people are out of office, people are taking trips,
Yeah.
so there's certain times of year where it is slower. And I do try to communicate that with the candidate too and say, just to let you know, my client is out of office for the next week or whatever, and just have everyone on the same page.
Right. And let's dig a little deeper on that because there are more delays, uncontrollable aspects of the hiring process that you deal with. And at the same time, like you mentioned, we are in the middle. So we need to make sure that the candidate experience is top notch. And at the same time, we want to make sure that we're not, saying anything negatively about who we're working with as part of that and the blame game and everything like that. So what are some other ways that you try to maneuver around those situations so that you're understanding of the chaotic schedule of the hiring managers and at the same time continuing to have those touch points with your candidates directly?
Well, I think that candidates just want some communication. And, even if I'm just reaching out to candidates and saying, hey, they haven't come to a decision yet, or hey, they're still interviewing candidates, but you're still in the mix, I think that people appreciate just that contact in general. And, that is usually the case is things move slower sometimes because there are other interviews happening and maybe there's not 10 interviews happening in one day, maybe they're spread out. So I think there's also just the reality that things take time and making sure that candidates understand that they haven't been forgotten. They're still involved, but there's just a little bit of a waiting period. So I try to give an update even when there's no update to give, even just saying, I don't have an update, but I know that you're there. I know that you're waiting. And, thanks for your patience. I think that goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's tools now in place that a lot of recruiters can and should be utilizing to do those types of things. Have that, like you said, no update is still an update. So, if you can have that consistent communication, whether you're using some form of software or tool even to help facilitate that, it's certainly a good reminder to have in place. So let's talk about a little bit more about the candidate experience from your own perspective as well. How do you try to make or emphasize that you're creating a fair and inclusive recruitment and hiring process? I know that you and I have discussed when you went through your own search for your next position, next career, there were things in place that you wanted to make sure that the next company that you worked for had. So now that you're in that position, how do you try to utilize that to your advantage and make sure that you're kind of catering to those desires for the candidates that you're working with?
Yeah, I definitely wanted a diverse environment when I was looking. I work for a woman-owned company, which, for me, that was something that I was really excited about. But as far as like diversity and inclusion in recruitment, of course, I try to be as unbiased as possible. I'm trying to present diverse candidates. Um, you know, I think also just acknowledging people's differences and celebrating their diversity is important. I make people feel very welcome on my calls. I get to know them. I just think focusing on people's skills and their uniqueness is important. And what I love to consider is, people think, oh, how do I say this? Fitting in culturally, right? I don't like the whole idea of a culture fit. I like the idea of a culture add. You may have seen that kind of floating around on LinkedIn from time to time. And I think that's something to really focus on is what can this person add to your culture? What unique perspective, diverse views, as opposed to fitting in a certain cookie cutter type, situation. So I really like to, find out about people's uniqueness and emphasize that to the hiring manager. Like, look at this new perspective you could bring in.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk the dreaded feedback question, because I think that's one of the biggest things that we see, not just on LinkedIn, but kind of across anything, especially if you're on Reddit, and see kind of some of the complaints that are focused on recruitment and the lack of feedback in some instances. So, there's times where hands are tied, or sometimes, and this is what I try to tell people, sometimes I just don't have feedback that is necessarily going to be valuable to you, whether it was one thing that you might have been missing that you couldn't have possibly had, or a thing that shouldn't necessarily be seen as something that's negative towards you. So how beneficial is this feedback going to be? So some instances I can give it, but more often than not, it's just kind of one of those situations where there's so many applicants, so many candidates, and it was just kind of that unfortunate circumstance. So, how often are you able to give feedback? What are some of the ways that you try to deliver that in a way that's going to benefit the candidate? Because you're creating a relationship, especially from an agency perspective, where you're hopefully going to continue working with this person.
Sure. I agree with you more times than not. I also don't have valuable feedback that I can give. I think a lot of times my clients are just, leaning towards one candidate for whatever reason. This candidate stood out. They had a great conversation. There's not anything wrong with the other candidates. And I know that everyone wants feedback, but you're exactly right. There just isn't always feedback to give. They just chose someone else.
Mhm.
If there is something that a client says, oh, you know what, we really liked this person because they had XYZ experience, then sometimes I can say to that candidate, you know what, they're prioritizing candidates that have XYZ experience, and you just didn't have it at this time. Sorry, it didn't work out, whatever. That's an easier pill to swallow, but we don't always get that. We don't
Right.
always get that feedback. If there is something that is said that I think will genuinely help this person moving forward. Like they interviewed poorly, they seemed very nervous. I will try to help them and I will tell them, you just didn't bring the confidence they were looking for. I recommend, practicing your interviewing more, get someone to assist you. I will assist you. I do try to prep candidates. I get on a call with them, but I think that sometimes as the external recruiter, there's less pressure. So they speak with me very comfortably. But
Yeah.
then when they're in front of the hiring manager, it's a different kind of pressure. So
Right.
it's hard. I prepare people best I can, but it's not always the same setting. So, if I can provide anything that I do think will help them in moving forward, I absolutely will. But what candidates don't tend to not understand is usually the feedback is so minimal. It's just, no, it's not the right fit or whatever. It's like, whatever that means, and then they went with someone else. So, yeah, it's controversial, but it's unfortunately the way it is.
Yeah. So that being said, how do you try to deliver that? Are you a phone call type of person? Is it more email? Do you try to give the choice? I've always kind of found that people see a phone call incoming and they think good news, and then if it's not an offer for the position, then that's kind of takes the wind out of their sails, and they don't say it, but I kind of can sense in tone sometimes of you could have just emailed me this. So I
Yeah.
usually stick to that. But what is usually your mindset when it goes into how you're delivering that?
Yeah, I think it depends too on the relationship and how far along we are in the, if it's just that first round that they had and they're not moving forward, I usually do it in an email and, thanks so much for your time. This was the feedback, or I don't have feedback, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But, sometimes I've been working with a candidate on this position. They've interviewed multiple rounds. I've established this, pretty strong relationship with them. And at that point, I might do a phone call, just to kind of be supportive of them and, see how I can help. But I agree. I think that most people these days prefer an email, a text. Like they just want to take the news and move forward.
Right. Yep. Absolutely. So let's talk about the role that branding plays in the way that you recruit and how you create the positive candidate experience. Because I've seen more people talking about this on LinkedIn now, especially in recruiting, and just how important who you are and your personal brand and how much that plays a role in your style of recruiting and how you're able to attract candidates and top talent. So how do you try to utilize not just your own personal brand, but working with different companies, it can be tricky. So your agency's brand, how do you try to roll that all into a way that you're making that a positive impact on the candidate experience?
It's multi-layered. Like you said, being an agency recruiter, I'm not so much my client's brand, but I'm an extension of their brand.
Mhm.
So I'm very much my own personal brand, and then of course representing my agency. So a few things with that. One, I'm very present on LinkedIn. If you follow me on LinkedIn, which obviously you do, Matt, but anyone else follows me, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. I post a lot of content. I post a lot of personal things.
Yep.
And part of that is because I want to gain trust
Yep.
and I want to be relatable, because there are a lot of scams out there. People don't always trust a recruiter message. They're like, what is this? Is this legit?
Mhm.
So I want people to see I'm a real person. I'm a human being. You can talk to me. Don't delete my message. This is not
Right.
spam. So that's part of it. And then, of course, building my network is so important, because when I do get these jobs in, I already have this huge pipeline of talent. So just making people aware of what I recruit for, the industries that I recruit for, helps me to create this large network. So that's also very helpful. And of course, just with my agency in general, we want to attract new clients. We want to attract new candidates. So representing my agency, sharing information about my agency is another part of my branding. Now, when it comes to my clients, I want to go to market with a very positive, very exciting little, nugget of why it's great to work there. So I'm selling them as a company. I'm presenting them to my candidates. A lot of the candidates I in positions, because I'm reaching out to anyone that meets the qualifications, whether they're on the market or not. I'm looking to fill a role with a skill set, so I'm reaching out to people. So they might be in a job. So I need to, present this job, this company, and show them how exciting this role is and attract them to this company in this role. So, that's another layer. So I have a lot of different, branding components, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why you and I have connected so well. Is I have the similar mindset in terms of putting a lot of myself out there, and I'm sure you've heard it as much as I have sometimes. Well, this post is more Facebook than LinkedIn, and that's kind of the point at this point for me. Is it's a social networking site at the end of the day, and if people are trusting me to make a huge decision about the next step in their career, then they certainly deserve to know a little bit about who I am outside of just this is what I do as a recruiter. So maybe the pictures and whatnot are a little bit more personal, but I think that kind of helps to create that positive candidate experience because people know who Matt is and not just, well, this is my recruiter.
Yeah, I mean, none of us are just our job. None of
Right.
us are just a company. And, I know I see that stuff too about, oh, it's so Facebook, but it's not. It's humanizing, our position as a recruiter that we're people, we understand, we support others. I don't know. LinkedIn is social media.
Mhm.
It's business oriented, but it's still social media.
Yeah.
So yeah, and you're right. You and I are very similar in that way. And I think that's why we have such great networks is because people see us as people.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So obviously social media is one of the huge aspects in terms of how you can maintain a positive candidate experience. But how do you try to stay up to date with some of the other best hiring practices or new technology, new applicant tracking systems that come through that are going to help you as a recruiter or the hiring managers kind of stay on top of communication and making engagement and candidate experience top priority for them?
So we use Salesforce as our CRM at Talentfoot. Salesforce, Salesforce is our ATS, the boogeyman that
Yeah.
everyone always talks about.
Yeah.
But it's just our organization tool. So I'm able to, keep all of my contacts and all of my candidates close. Like the old school Rolodex,
Right.
just dating myself, but I can keep checking in on people. I can send out messages. I can set reminders for myself, like don't forget, Ashley is starting her job next week. Check in with her, and that's how I use it to my advantage. And then I'll also say that when I'm talking with candidates, I make sure to ask how they prefer communication. So, and I offer texting
Mhm.
because people like to text, and
Right.
that's just where it is in 2024. I can text from my work number, and I can kind of keep it somewhat of balance so that people are not blowing up my cell phone at all hours of the day.
Right.
But I think that people seem to really appreciate the texting aspect because it just gives them a little bit of that comfortability, like, oh, I can shoot Shawna a text and say, hey, have you heard anything?
Mhm.
It's becoming a professional communication tool where I think 5 years ago people were like texting that's unprofessional, right? And I think things have changed.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So it wouldn't be an episode of Maximize Monday if I didn't ask the advice question. You've been on the show enough. You've given a lot of different advice in different perspectives as a transitioning educator, as someone preparing for interviews, as a recruiter itself. And right now, and you and I have both kind of seen this, the recruitment industry has gone through some challenges these last couple of years. And it's not as popular of an industry as it was a couple years ago for people to try to get into, but still is one of those ones that people who have an interest in hiring in HR or looking to try something new, recruiting does stand out as kind of a path that they can take. So, what advice would you give to new recruiters who are trying to shape who they are and find their voice, build their brand? As someone in talent acquisition, what would you say is a key component or what they should try to do as they're starting out?
I would say, to those new recruiters, because I feel like I'm still a new recruiter and I'm only 2 years in, is, just be yourself and remember that people are people, your candidates are people. So treat them, as you would like to be treated. And that means, not ghosting. And I think that ghosting is, doesn't happen as much as we hear about it happening, I
Right.
think. But treat people with respect, and they will remember you. And even if you didn't place them in a position, they'll come back to you or they'll refer you to others because of the way that they were treated. And that's for sure for me, something that I've realized as a new recruiter is, teaching, you don't always feel appreciated.
Right.
It's a tough gig. And I feel like I have felt way more appreciated in 2 years of recruiting versus 17 years of teaching.
Mhm.
Maybe because we're dealing with adults, and they're in a vulnerable situation, they're looking for a job. And so just treating someone with kindness and with empathy and being supportive, being a cheerleader to them, maybe you're not placing them in this position, but you're happy to be a resource for them. You're happy to go over their resume. You're happy to do an interview prep with them. Things like that mean a lot to people, and that's what's going to bring you success. Being kind and going above and beyond enough.
Yeah, and I always encourage people to, build those connections. It's a two-way street. So, the coffee chats, the introductory calls, they're a great way not to just meet new people, but also kind of expand upon your skills as a recruiter, find out what people are looking for, get an idea of the frustrations of the job search, and utilize that to make yourself better in talent acquisition.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, as always, Shawna, I'm so appreciative of you jumping on here. It certainly won't be the last time I reach out to you and ask you to join me for one of these types of calls because I always appreciate the insight that you have to offer. So if you aren't connected following Shawna at this point, make sure that you do. Like she mentioned, she's very active on LinkedIn and is kind of creating that brand that I think is very important in talent acquisition. So thanks so much for the insight. Thank you for everyone who watched, listened, and we will see you next week.
Thanks, Matt.